On today's show, we're going to make a simple and elegant wall shelf. So simple, in fact, that you could make it in a weekend. So that's why I call it the weekend wall shelf. One of my favorite things about being a woodworker is what I like to call the utility factor. Now, what I mean by that is the ability to make things for the home, for family and friends that can actually be used. There's a lot of hobbies out there and a lot of places we could spend our money that don't yield anything. It's just fun, it's just something we do for recreation, but the final product, there really is no final product, let's put it that way. Woodworking isn't like that. With woodworking, we can actually make stuff that people can use and that can enrich our lives. So this particular project is one that Nicole requested. There's no reason to overcomplicate it, despite that being part of my nature. I always want to put more stuff into a project, but the reality is sometimes a wall shelf can just be a wall shelf. It doesn't have to be this groundbreaking thing. We don't really have to push the limits of our personal abilities in every single project. So that's what this one is going to be, is more of an exercise in restraint than anything else. So let's dive right in. This wall shelf was inspired by a few pictures I found online. It features a thick backbone and 3 individual shelves that increase in length, with the widest at the bottom. While it's not the same style as the trestle table we built recently, it is made from the same wood and looks great next to the desk. Now keep in mind, with a shelf unit like this, you don't necessarily need to follow my measurements. The joy of this project is that you can customize it to fit wherever you want it to go. You need your shelves to be a little bit deeper? That's no problem at all. You want to change the dimensions of the top, middle, or bottom shelf? No problem there either. The one thing I would recommend, though, is that you keep the back vertical piece pretty thick, and you want it to be thicker than the shelf material, because all of our support is coming from that back unit, and when we make those dados in there, we don't really want to compromise the structure by removing too much material. So a nice thick back vertical member is definitely recommended. Now, my material is already milled, and if you need help with that process, go back into the archive to one of our earlier episodes, the joiner's jumping, and I go over the entire milling process in that episode. Now, my stock, a couple of my pieces here still need to be cut to length, so let's head over to the chop saw and we'll get that done. So I've already cut one end square, and then I measure over 24 inches, because this is for my middle shelf, put a pencil line, and then I just line up my pencil line with the laser. And I'll tell you, frankly, I've got mixed feelings about lasers. Sometimes I think they're ridiculous, and other times they come in handy. Now, each of our shelves is going to sit in a 3/4 inch deep dado that we need to cut into our back support piece. Now, there are literally hundreds of different ways that you could cut that dado. The one we're going to use involves the use of a handheld router, a pattern bit, and a specialized jig that's going to allow us to cut a dado of any particular size and get it right the first time, every time. Let's check it out. Now here is my jig. Obviously this one is significantly oversized. The truth is, this particular jig serves 2 purposes. Not only can I use it for dados in this project, but its original intent was to be used at the table saw to create coves. Now, I did a video on this in the past for the guild, and then I showed how to make this particular jig. So since I'm reusing the jig for this project, I figured let me show you the clip of how to actually make this one. Just keep in mind that when you make yours, if you're really just making it for creating dados, it can be made on a much smaller scale, and you could really simplify things. In fact, I think I'll throw a few links to some free plans on the web for very similar jigs that are built on a smaller scale. But if you want one that also does coves at the table saw, which is kind of handy, check this clip out and you'll know how to make one. I'm disassembling the old jig just to give you a general idea of how it was constructed. Removing the knobs allows me to remove the connecting rails. Notice it's a pretty tight fit. The bolts are easily removed, and notice that on the bottom of the jig I created a recess so that the head of the bolt sits below the bottom surface of the jig. If you don't do this, the bolt will scratch your table saw top. So now let's build a new version of the jig. I start by making 2 4-inch wide rails from some Baltic birch. Consider ripping a third piece for other parts of the jig. With the 2 pieces ganged together, I trim one end flush and then carefully flip the pieces around and trim them to final length, 54 inches. Keep in mind that your cutoffs from this step could also be used later on in the process. My cutoffs weren't long enough, so I needed to rip a third piece of Baltic birch for this step. I'm cutting the small 4" by 2" pieces that go under the connecting rails. To make quick work of it, I use a pencil line on the saw surface as a guide. If you're careful to put the workpiece up to the line the same way every single time, this is remarkably accurate. I cut 8 pieces this way. Now we need to drill the bolt holes in the dead center of the small blocks. I simply draw a couple lines corner to corner to find the exact center. At the drill press, I set up my fence and stop block so that I can make a repeatable hole. I drill all 8 pieces this way. Now we need to make the 2 connecting rails. Mine are 13 inches long and 1.5 inches wide. Using the adjustable square, I mark a line 1 inch in from each edge. And then I mark the center point of that line, which is approximately 3/4 of an inch. Using the drill press and a stop block again, I set up for repeatable drilling. Each end of both connecting rails is drilled this way. Now I need to mark the locations of the support blocks. I mark a line in 2 inches from the edge of one of the long rails. Using my line for reference, I use glue and a couple of brad nails to secure the support block. Now instead of measuring on the other side and drawing a line, I want a more accurate way of ensuring exact spacing on both of my rails. So I use a scrap piece of ply cut to 46 inches as a guide. I rest the other support block right against the guide and secure it with glue and brads. Repeat the process for the second rail. Now I need to use the holes in the support blocks as guides for drilling all the way through the rails. And then I use a Forstner bit to create the recesses for the bolt heads. And now, with the bolts inserted, we can assemble the jig.
Now, regardless of whether you build this exact jig or something more specific for making dados, the process is really going to be the same thing. So let's start with laying out the locations of each of our dados. Our bottom shelf is going to be located 4 inches up from the very bottom of the back support. So just put a line at 4 inches, and to make sure it's nice and square to my sides, extend line like so. Now we don't actually have to put the other line because remember, with the jig, the workpiece is going to show us where the other side of that dado is going to be. So just draw the starting points. Now the second shelf is located 17 inches up from the bottom. And our top shelf is located 28 inches up from the bottom, or approximately 6 inches down from the top. Now the key to this whole thing working properly is this little guy called a pattern bit. Let me show you up close. Now the pattern bit is one of my absolute favorite router bits. I use these guys all the time in the shop. The magic here is this little bearing right above the cutter head. And really this is nothing more than a straight router bit with a perfectly sized bearing that's exactly even with the edge of the cutter head itself. So this way, if you have your jig or some sort of a guide along your pencil line here, and you run the router bit across, as long as this bearing is contacting your guide, you're going to get a perfect cut, perfectly even with wherever you place your guide. So that's why we put the guide even with the pencil line and make a couple passes, and we should have a perfectly sized dado. But let's get into the details of that. Let's set up the jig now. So let me give you a quick overview of the setup that I'm going to use here. First of all, the back support piece is clamped firmly to the workbench. I've got one in the front, 2 clamps in the back. This puppy's not going anywhere. The jig is laid approximately at one of the dados that you're going to cut. I'm going to start in the middle because that's the easiest one for me to film for you, but you could do any one of the 3 really. Place it approximately where it needs to go. Don't worry about lining it up perfectly. Now, one of the disadvantages of having this really long jig is the fact that it's a little bit tipsy like that. So I've got a couple of supports. I'm going to put these here.
Now the other reason you want these supports is because when we put clamping pressure to secure the jig to the workpiece, you can't put clamping pressure right here where we really want it, because obviously if we have clamps here, the router isn't going to make it. So what I like to do is clamp a little bit further to the outside, and the only way we can do that is if we have supports that are the same thickness as the material we're cutting into. The other thing I have are these low profile clamps and a little caul, and that's going to allow me to spread the clamping pressure. And of course I want to clamp right over that support. Okay, these are very easy to use. Just like so. Now let's line everything up perfectly and then we can make our first cut. Now all of our shelves are the same thickness, so I'm just going to use the smallest one for this just to make it a little bit easier to handle. I'm going to drop this down in between our two parts of our jig here, bring this other end in like so it's nice and tight. And in fact, it doesn't hurt at this point to add a clamp in here, just a little temporary clamp. That'll make sure nothing moves. It's really held nice and tight. Now one at a time, since if I release both of these clamps, the whole jig could move. I'm going to release one at a time very carefully. So on this side, I'm going to loosen the clamp, adjust the caul, and tighten it down again. Same process on the other side. We're going to tighten the jig, carefully loosen our clamp and caul here. Now we're covering both sides and we can tighten it down. Now all I need to do is remove the quick clamp, take our shelf out, and we should be ready to go. Now the final depth of our dado is going to be 3/4 of an inch, and that's a lot of material to remove. So resist the temptation to set this all the way down and plow that entire 3/4 in one shot. That would be a very bad idea. The quality of the cut is going to be bad, and it puts a heck of a lot of stress on a bit like this. So what I recommend doing is at least 2 passes. Go for 3 if you can. We can also set our router up here to make this process a little bit easier using our turret stops. So I start here by plunging down until the bit, the bottom of the bit here, contacts the surface of the work and tighten it down. This is sort of our 0 point. And what we know is that if we go 3/4 of an inch down from this point, we'll be at the right depth because we're right now sitting right on top of the surface. So loosen the bar here and make sure it contacts one of your turret stops. This little arm is an adjustment arm that allows us to gauge the depth of cut. So let me show you how this is going to work. It's on 0 right now, and this bar is touching the turret stop here, so we know this is the 0 point. If we raise this up to 3/4 of an inch, and this is metric here, so I'm going to go with 19 millimeters, right about there, tighten this arm down. Now the distance between the turret stop and the plunge bar here is 3/4 of an inch, or 19 millimeters. So when I plunge down, once I finally bottom out, we should be at our full 3/4 inch depth. So before I make my actual cut, the last thing I want to mention is the directionality. Because the bit's rotating in a particular direction, sometimes if you go the wrong way, and I know some of you have experienced this, the router can kind of just take off on you because you're pushing it in the same direction as the rotation. So you want to really work against that rotation, and the way we do it is in this particular situation, I'm going to be pushing the router up against this back guide and going from left to right. Once I'm all the way through the cut, I'm now going to be pushing on my front guide over here, and I'm going to be going from right to left. And that should ensure that I'm always making a cut against the direction of the bit, as opposed to what is known as a climb cut, which tends to whoop, get away from you. So we're going to take about 1/4 inch on this first pass. Down another 1/4 inch. And now we bottom out, and that should be the full 3/4. And the moment of truth, let's see how we did.
Very nice. Now I've got 2 more dados to do this exact same way, but as you can see, this is a really handy jig. It doesn't matter what the thickness of this workpiece is. It doesn't have to be exactly 3/4 of an inch. With a jig like that, I can make the adjustment and get a perfectly fitting dado every time. Now just because I want you guys to have as many tricks up your sleeve as possible, let me show you one more thing. Now you can actually buy these pattern bits in different diameters. This one happens to be exactly 3/4 of an inch. So all you would really need to do, instead of messing with the jig that we were using earlier, is take any straight edge, just a piece of scrap, whatever you've got on hand, clamp it down right against your line, and run this piece in one pass. Now one pass will give you an exact 3/4 inch wide dado. Now here's where the problem is. If you don't have absolute control over the thickness of your shelf stock, this is going to be hard because you don't know that you're exactly 3/4 of an inch. But if you've got a planer or a drum sander, or you're handy with your hand planes, and you could finesse this to be the exact thickness to get a perfect fit, you could always use one of these pattern bits and just the straight edge to make the job that much simpler. Now with all 3 dados cut, we could start to think about some of the interesting and cool things we might want to do to this back support. You could certainly just keep it square, you know, a nice long rectangle like this if you want to. You can introduce curves if you want to. I mean, nothing that you do to this is really going to affect the fit of those shelves, so use your imagination. For me, I'm doing something very straightforward and simple. I just want to sort of echo the sense of how the shelves are getting, you know, narrower as we go from the bottom to the top. I want to echo that in this back piece, starting with the full 8-inch width at the bottom and ending with, I think, 6 inches wide at the top. So we need to introduce a taper to each side, and that's very easy to do. We're just going to draw a line 1 inch in from each edge at the top. Place a mark here. Do one on this side. And now I simply line up a straight edge with the very bottom corner here and bring the top over to my 1 inch line. And draw all the way across. And of course, on the other side, we'll do the same thing. Now there are lots of ways that you can cut this taper. I think the most obvious one that comes to mind is using a tapering jig at the table saw. Now I actually don't have a tapering jig that size that can handle a piece like this, and frankly I just don't feel like building one. It's Sunday, I'm feeling lazy, and I'm just going to use my bandsaw to do it. Now the bandsaw, if you have it set up properly, it should track pretty true, and if you just take your time, you could follow your line and just leave a little extra material there, because we'll go back to the bench and we'll use hand planes, sanders, you know, whatever you have on hand. You could even take this back to the jointer if you wanted to clean up that edge and give you a nice straight clean edge all the way up. Now that cut is pretty darn straight, and I still have my pencil line as a guide. So I could sort of sight down, whichever side, this side, I could sight down and use a block plane to knock down any high spots and just even things out as good as I can. That's looking pretty good. And then once it's relatively flat, of course now, let's take a step back. If you've got a number 7 or a number 8 jointer plane, you could just run it straight across and get a nice dead flat surface. But the thing is, as long as you're pretty close to your pencil line, you could just jump right to your smoothing plane, because the truth is, this being absolutely dead on flat and true isn't really necessary. It's a decorative edge. We're not joining this to anything else. So once it's pretty flat, you can come back with your smoothing plane, and that'll help you make a few final passes to smooth out any of the milling marks. Now, if hand planes aren't your thing, don't forget you can always use a sander. I've just got a 6-inch random orbit sander, and I'm going to be very careful as I sand this edge to make sure that I don't sort of lean it one way or the other, which is very easy to do. That's why a sander really isn't the ideal choice for this, but you got the one advantage of not having to worry about grain direction, and if you're not real good with your hand tools, this is a reasonable way to get the job done. Now the final treatment for both the back support and my shelves involves the creation of a little chamfer along the edge. It sort of just continues this theme of angles and more harsh lines than I normally bring into things that I build. I like curves, but this is one thing where I'm sort of committed to more straight geometrical harsh lines on this one. So I'm just continuing the theme by creating the chamfer all the way across the edge.
Now the back support gets this chamfer on all 4 sides, and I'm going to use the table saw to do the 2 long edges. You know, the top and bottom, we're probably going to have to do those by hand, but that's no problem. It's a small amount of material. So I'm going to set the saw up here for about a 65-degree cut. And to get a 65-degree cut, I need to bring my saw to 25 on my gauge. Now for my shelves, I'm going to leave the blade right where it is, but I adjust my fence so that this chamfer comes in and leaves me about 1/8 of an inch of straight stock here at the top. I don't want to go all the way to make a really sharp point. So that looks pretty good. Now, of course, I can't cut the sides here using the fence. That's just too dangerous. So I'm going to use my miter gauge. Flip the piece around like this, turn it upside down so that the angle is now working in our favor here. And I should be able to just carefully make a cut. And in fact, I may just use a clamp to prevent this from sliding back and forth at all. Now we still need to bevel this area here, and I'm just going to use my block plane to do it. Of course, I can give myself a few visual references that will help. First of all, I've got my adjustable square, and I want to know the distance between the top of this bevel and the side here. So I'm just going to get that as close as I can and put that line on the top. Now that's my top guideline. So I want another guideline on the end grain, and all I need to do is connect the dots here on the 2 lower portions of this bevel. Block plane should make quick work of this. I'm starting to get close to my line back here, so I may want to lay off until I'm a little bit closer on the end grain. So I'll tilt the plane a little bit this way. That looks good. And now it's time for everybody's favorite part of woodworking, sanding. Of course, we do need to sand the entire surface of every shelf and also the back piece just to make sure that the finish comes out the best that it possibly can. Without a good, clean, sanded surface, all those flaws and errors will become very visible once you hit them with finish. Now, we have a lot of bevels here, and you don't really want to hit that with the random orbit sander because you'll round them over. So I use a hand sanding block for that, and I take everything up to 180. Now for the flat areas, no problem with the random orbit sander. That's what I'm going to use. And I'll also bring that surface up to 180. So let me put my dust mask on, and got about a half hour of sanding here to do. All right, sanding is done. We can now do a little dry assembly, which is pretty straightforward. Just drop the shelves in. Everything looks pretty good. Now to do the glue up on this, we need to have a couple things in place ahead of time. First of all, we need to know when our shelves are perfectly centered. So typically I would use pencil lines for that, but I don't want to put a pencil line on a surface I just sanded. So that's one concern. The second thing is squeeze out. If there's any glue that comes out and over onto the surface, it would be nice to have some protection there. So blue tape to the rescue. A nice strip along the bottom here. Push it right up against the shelf and then fold it down. Perfect. Now we can add a significant amount of strength to these shelves if we screw them in. Now normally I wouldn't do this if it was something that I would be able to see, but this thing is going to be mounted on the wall. The screw heads in the back, you'll never see them, so as long as they're below the surface, they won't interfere with anything. So the way that we're going to do this is by starting the drilling from the front. And there's two. And your screw should be able to fall right in like that. And it's not a bad idea to back this material up when you do that initial drilling to avoid any tear out. I do have a little bit of tear out here, but I'm going to countersink, and that's going to get rid of most of it anyway. Now before we add our glue and drive those screws home, we need to make sure that we pre-drill our shelf. With 3/4 inch stock like this, if we just drive one of these screws straight in without pre-drilling, bad things can happen. We could very well split these boards. So I want to make sure I get a bit that's just under the size of my screw itself, follow the hole that's already there, and clear out some material. So I'm just going to use Titebond Extend, which gives me a little bit more working time. Get plenty of glue here in the dado. See if we can't carefully flip this guy over. There we go. I'll make sure we're all lined up. A little wax never hurt anyone. Certainly helps that screw go in easier. Now I removed the tape from the joints, and even though the glue isn't completely dry yet, it's okay for me to start finishing it. The screws are holding everything in place, and I did give it about a half hour, 45 minutes up to this point to let the glue start to set. So, time to start talking about the finish. For me, finish of choice on this one is going to be General Finishes Armor Seal. Surprise, surprise. You guys probably know by now that I put that on maybe 80 or 90% of the projects that I do. This particular shelf is going right above a desk that I just made. That desk received several coats of Armor Seal, so it's a good idea to use the same finish so everything kind of looks the same. Now, if you need a little bit more information and more detail on this type of a wipe-on varnish finish, check out my DVD. It's a simple varnish finish, and you can find that at the Wood Whisperer store. But for the most part, a simple varnish finish is an apt name because it actually is a relatively simple process. But sometimes you need to see all of the steps and all of the details, and that's what the DVD is there for. So I just have one of my rags here. I'm going to take some of my well-mixed satin finish. Remember that satin has those flatteners in there. If you don't mix it, you're going to wind up with a streaky finish. Pour the finish into the secondary container here so I don't contaminate my stock, and we just start applying. And remember, the good thing is on this first coat, you could be as messy as you want because the wood is very, very thirsty, and it's going to pull all that finish right into the fiber, so you don't have to be too careful about it. Just love how an oil-based finish brings that mahogany to life. It's gorgeous. Gorgeous. Now at the top here, you got a decision to make. Do you let the finish go into the dado? Now normally, if we were gluing, absolutely not. The finish is going to cause us problems with the adhesion of the glue. In this case, I'm not using glue, so I really need it to be a tight fit. So use your judgment. If your shelf is fitting in perfectly with absolutely no flaws and no space whatsoever, you might want to avoid getting finish in there. Maybe just one very light coat like this and wipe out the excess just to make sure that it doesn't build, but you're kind of sealing the wood fibers. If you have a little bit of a loose fit, well, maybe this is the opportunity to take advantage of the finish and build up a little bit of a film so that helps to tighten things up a little bit. In my case, it's a pretty tight fit, so I don't want to put too much finish here, just enough to seal those fibers. And of course, don't forget to apply finish to the back. It's going up against the wall, but you still want to make sure you get some finish on there. So after 4 coats of a satin wiping varnish, our wall hanging shelf is ready to be hung. Now let's take this top shelf out so we could talk about how we're going to anchor it. Now you really want to give this some serious thought because unless you have a stud to put this into, this is quite a bit of weight to have to support with drywall alone. Fortunately, there are things out there that you can use that'll do that, but you need to do some research. First of all, the first thing I looked at was a standard toggle bolt. Now a toggle bolt is nothing more than a standard bolt that is put through this little spring-loaded toggle. So you drill a hole in the wall, pop this guy through, and once that's in the inner cavity, it pops open, and now you can tighten it up, and those arms spread out and stop the toggle from coming back through. It's one way only. The problem is, to get the full benefit of the support of this, you're going to need to have the toggle be vertical. Okay, if it's horizontal, you're not going to get as much weight capacity out of that. So I think it would still be enough for this project. I mean, this piece itself, the shelf itself, weighs about 16 pounds. So it's not going to get significantly heavier than that just by putting some DVDs or CDs or little figurines or whatever the heck Nicole's going to put on there. But I never usually settle for good enough. I like to overkill, especially when it comes to the possibility of something falling off of my wall. And I looked around and I found in Lowe's they had this product. It's called Wing It, or Wingits. Now, what makes this different is the fact, number one, it's plastic. But the primary thing is the fact that it's got these 3 arms instead of just 2. So now when this goes into the wall and you start tightening it up, you've got 3 arms spreading out, which means regardless of which orientation this is in, you're going to get a whole lot more support because it's spreading out in 3 directions. Now, the company rates these at 300 pounds a piece. So if I've got 2 of these in my wall, I sure as heck hope that that's enough to support this. So this is what I'm going to use, and it all starts by drilling a couple holes into the back of the dado there. Now this will go in the wall, and this piece here is going to sit flush. Okay, so what I need to do is be able to get this bolt through the shelf unit itself. So all we need to do is drill a couple holes that are just a little bit bigger than the size of that bolt. So let's get started. So now the next thing I need to do is make sure I know where the location of these bolt heads are so that I could remove a little extra stock on the back of this top shelf, and this way everything will be seated perfectly. So actually the easiest way to do this, very low tech, is to put my shelf in, take my drill, and just drill through the back. Just enough to make a mark. I don't really want to drill through it. My rasp should do a fine job of it. A little sanding just to smooth it out. Not that anyone will ever see it, but then hit it with a little bit of finish. A simple and elegant wall shelf that only takes a couple days to build. And if you're lucky like me, it'll knock another thing off that honey-do list. Thanks for watching.